emergencies and the state. We will be recording this for our YouTube channel, so if you're not comfortable about being on YouTube, please do sort of keep your cameras off. We won't be recording the Q&A at the end. So today we have two wonderful speakers. We have Leo from Durham University and Nat from University of Manchester, who are going to be giving two different talks around sort of emergencies and the state, which will be really great. They'll have around 20 minutes each, and then we'll open up the floor to Q&A. If you want to write your notes of your questions, so then raise your hand at the end, please do, or throw your questions in the chat in the meantime. But yes, thank you all so much for coming along, and thank you again to our two wonderful speakers. Leo, I will pass the floor to you.
Yep, thank you. Then let's start and see whether we can share it. Yeah, welcome from my side to the governance of extreme events and the parametric guarantee of security. I'm a fourth-year PhD student in Durham in geography, and the governance of an extreme event has accompanied me now for quite a while, and particularly the event or the scenario of the blackout. I will split the talk in two sections. The main focus will be on the blackout, how I use it in my work, how I use it to describe it as an extreme event, why it is a potential catastrophe, and then in a second bit to basically try to start a little discussion. And I want to do that by conceptualizing security as parametrical, as a guarantee that is only there in part. Yeah, the blackout for me in my PhD is primarily just there in the background. It's a methodological device that I use to understand, to visualize and interrogate the technologies and techniques that are used to secure the constant flow of electricity. For me, the blackout is a potential extreme event, and it is in the contrast against this extreme that the relevance of the mundane everyday routines and practices that are to secure the flow of electricity come pronounced and visual for me. It's a personal interest, the blackout for me, as I have some military background, and I'm also an active civil defense volunteer in Germany and do a lot of work on critical infrastructures or infrastructure security there. The blackout for grid operators, regulators, and emergency planners is a design-based event, to use a nuclear language, or a maximum credible event for which the power grid, their systems have to be designed for and to able to sustain it, or and to prepare for it, so they are able to restart the grid after it has failed. If I talk about the blackout, then it's never an event that we can grasp with probabilities. It's always just a scenario that is possible, so possibilistic scenario, and this is quite important. When we talk about the blackout, we can really not grasp it without understanding it as a dependence of dependence of us on electricity. And this, of course, is growing, is increasing. The blackout is not, and even though it is colloquially used often to describe such an everyday event, a local and intermittent power outage, but it's an extraordinary event that is widespread and in the scale of regions, countries, or even continents, and has the potential to be long-lasting. It is short-lived, that means hours to days, and when it is short-lived, it can be an adventure or carnival, and we see that usually in the birth statistics after the big major disasters in the US, the hurricanes, the winter storms, etc. If the people are prepared to stay at home and have a candlelight dinner, there might be an increase in the birth rate, or statistically, historically, it has actually been so. Nevertheless, this carnival can turn into catastrophe if the blackout is prolonged. Yeah, even though it is not really that wise to talk about causes when we talk about scenarios, about possible events, it is important to recognize that the potential causes for a blackout are rather plentiful. They can at first be a function of the complexity of the grid itself, as the infrastructures it supports, it enables, and depends are all so tightly coupled, to use Perrow's language, complex and interdependent, that a blackout can be simply a normal accident, a reflexive event that is constituted within the system itself. It can be caused by natural events. We had the storms, hurricanes, winter storms, etc. The tree trunk falling on the transmission line because the corridor of the power line hasn't been maintained well. And of course, in a year of 2024, a solar maximum, we have also considered things like a coronal mass ejection that is hitting Earth. On the last side of causes, or the last area of causes, of course, the intentional act, yeah, hybrid warfare, sabotage, or just conventional warfare, or even nuclear are back on the agenda of some states, at least are back on the minds, or should be, of the emergency preparedness personnel. Anyways, if we talk about a blackout, it is always a moment of collective disempowerment and demodernization. And it usually robs us, it disempowers us in that it robs us of our electric tools. It denies us their service, and we are faced to rely on seemingly ancient forms to communicate, to ask for directions, for example, to cook on an open fire, or for transportation, you simply have to walk, to just name a few. And of course, this disempowerment and demodernization is not just happening for the average public, but it's also affecting the emergency service providers or the military, even though they have stockpiles on auxiliary generators, but it usually complicates things quite a lot. The blackout is a disempowerment and demodernization. It's an extreme, but why is it a catastrophe? And besides, why is it a catastrophe? And here we can generally say that we are not very good at grasping all the interrelations of the infrastructure or infrastructural failures, but we can basically reduce this complexity into something of an exponential function. The longer and the widespread, the more damaging to lives and matter a blackout is. The problem of a blackout are those cascading and escalating failures in all those infrastructures that rely on electricity. And I would be really interested if you in the Q&A session afterwards can only name me one infrastructure that today is not reliant on electricity. Besides this successes failure of our life support systems, what is also highly problematic and oftentimes ignored or forgotten by us researchers, by emergency planners, or even sometimes the public, is that with the extent, or with this growing extent of loss, always comes along a prolonged restoration and recovery time as well. To just give a few examples of maybe some cascades. Traffic accidents are almost immediate and imminent to a blackout. The lights go out, and with that also the traffic lights, and we can expect people being confused, careless in the beginning. First fatalities, if so, or at least injuries. We have progressive failure, something that most people don't think about, but again, because it usually only affects a marginal group. People relying on home respirators, around 4 in 100,000 in the UK. And these usually only have a backup battery of 4 to 6 hours. And the big problem in Germany most definitely is that these people are not on the register of any emergency services. That has historical reasons. But so it's only onto themselves or the families to basically ensure that they have a backup power generator with which they can reload the batteries, etc., etc., as they cannot rely on necessarily the emergency services to bring them a generator to recharge their batteries. We go further along in time on the x-axis. Loss of water supply depends a lot on the topology, for example, but is something that, especially in hospital emergency preparedness and emergency plans, is sometimes usually for some reason a bit forgotten. They usually have and are legally required to have emergency auxiliary or just backup power for a set time frame. In Germany, that is usually around 72 hours. But also of this on-site storage of fuel is finite, and if the how do you say, if the contracts with the suppliers, with the external suppliers, are not in place or are rather not practiced, it's always a function of uncertainty whether the extra fuel is actually whether they are actually able to bring the extra fuel. So the loss of power depending after 24, 48, or even 72 hours. An interesting other side note, an example here. We expect that the power supply is restored relatively quickly after an event of local interruptions, more so than with a blackout. But one problem when it comes to backup power, even for the transmission substations of the transmission system operators themselves, in Germany or Europe, they're usually just 48 hours reliant on batteries, if these batteries are maintained well, if so, far less. And this electricity is needed to basically do the big switching operations in a substation, to reroute the flows of electricity from a power plant to the consumers. So the actual recovery time, or the window of opportunity to recover, to start a blacked out power grid, might actually be way shorter than we might expect. We are now approaching 3 days, and that is usually the end of most people's stockpiles. In Germany, we've done some research on these stockpiles, and usually for 3 days everyone has some supplies at home, but afterwards it gets quite bleak. And there is the saying, society is only 3 meals away from anarchy. And this is, I would say, rather true, but it depends. It depends on primarily the societal cohesion, the state in which the society is at the moment. And 2 quick examples: New York City blackout from 1977. The city was in a financial crisis, a lot of racism, poverty prevailing, and a 3-day blackout on the East Coast, and specifically in New York City, brought with it widespread looting, mass incarceration, and over 1,000 fires in New York City. New York City blackout 2003, an aftermath of 9/11, a very similar magnitude event, but the cohesion of the population of society was a very different one. And this is where Nye said it was a carnival, it was an adventure. People helped out, people barbecued on the street, a very different kind of feeling and experience. And just as a side note, these 2 events and this note that the downfall of society, if you want, or the degradation of society depends on the internal cohesion, might hint that we, if we talk about security, need to understand the term as something bigger than usually just, let's call them maybe hard power facts of how long are the emergency power supplies, and maybe the focus needs to be wider if we say we want to prepare for something that is so extreme. Yeah, but even if there are cases where a society affected by a blackout didn't went to mayhem, we have to soberly assess that even after a few days, it is no longer possible to guarantee area-wide supplies of vital necessary goods and services to meet the population's requirement within the region affected by the blackout. Public safety and security is jeopardized. The state can no longer meet its duty to protect the life and limbs of its citizens. And this quote comes from an assessment done for the German parliament, where they looked at the effects of a long-term blackout, and I think it's quite sobering. We can even go a step further, right? And think through what might happen and what might a world look like without electricity, when actually the systems cascading fail, right? When we have a reinforcing failure of these infrastructures and we are unable to basically restore the power grid, and a very specific kind of course of such an event, but basically for the US Congress, a set of scientists assessed and basically came to the conclusion that after a year, they would expect almost 90% of the North American population to be dead, and the population of New York City to be reduced to only 25,000. Such a scenario is possible. About its likelihood, we shall not judge, but should expect our government to take it seriously and prepare for it nevertheless. Or should we? And this is the transition to the last part of my talk. And at the start here stand two observations. That first, the resources for planning, for preparing, for training, for response, and for recovery will always be finite, while the avenue of possibility is wide open. And that secondly, that due to the possible scale of what might happen, even if these resources were not finite, there would always be a lag between response, relief, and recovery. So for me, this then results in the recognition that the state's security guarantee is finite and not universal. And of course, marginalized groups know this already. But what about the majority of the population? The security guarantee is partial, it is incomplete, and determined by the metrics used to describe it. It is bound by a set of parameters that used to define it. So for me, the security guarantee of the state and other actors, such as, for example, insurance companies, is almost always parametrical. The guarantee is only valid for within a very specific bandwidth that is more often than not decided by experts. The possibility of catastrophic events, such as the blackout, will not disappear. They are plausible and they are potential triggers. Intrinsic system complexity, vulnerabilities, extreme weather events, or conventional and hybrid warfare seem only to grow. So why are we in our research and practice of security not more precise about what it is or should be that we are calling security, resilience, or care? We know that security and indeed survival is not guaranteed for everyone in extreme events, but should the public not have a choice in how far the state's guarantee should extend? Like with insurance, the term and conditions apply, but too often are veiled in secrecy. Maybe to think and approach security as parametrical then opens a window of opportunity to engage, to be more engaging with its meaning, with the meaning of security, to be transparent and thus ultimately allowing for a more democratic response to the potential of catastrophe. And with that, I shall conclude. Thank you very much for your attention. And just as a fun side note, Tilly told me that the UK government does not provide its citizens with a guide for emergencies and preparedness or a stockpile list. So I just snuck in the one from the German government, as I think it's it's reasonable and a reasonable insurance to have at least stockpiles for around 10 to 14 days, so around 2 weeks worth of supplies even as a student. And if we do that, everyone would be a little bit more prepared. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Leo. Really, really fascinating talk. And the amount of conversations we've had about me keeping beans in my cupboard ready for a blackout has been phenomenal and very worthwhile, hopefully. So thank you, Leo. I will now pass to Nat, if that's okay.
Great, yeah. Thanks, Tilly, and thanks, Leo, for such a fascinating exploration of blackouts and the forms of governance that are kind of developing around blackouts and the kinds of politics which are kind of emergent here, particularly around like risky futures and how that's kind of potentially reconsolidating relationships between publics and the state, I suppose. Yeah, but anyway, so as Tilly said, I'm Nat O'Grady. I'm a senior lecturer at the Humanitarian Conflict Response Institute at the University of Manchester. I'm not really going to give, well, I'm going to give a little bit of like specific work that I'm doing at the moment, but a bit more of an overview as well about how my work over time has engaged with and kind of probed the role of the state in emergencies and how we might make sense of that role, I suppose. So I guess overall, my research kind of explores the forms of intervention through which governments attend to different emergencies. And on the one hand, this has meant tracing the set of kind of institutional arrangements and courses of action and strategies and techniques through which government security apparatuses kind of come into being in the moment of emergencies, but also before emergencies happen as well. But on the other, I've kind of inquired into how such kind of arrangements are underpinned by the mobilization of specific forms of knowledge through which governments rationalize and justify and legitimate their operation, both to themselves. So thinking about how the mobilization of particular forms of knowledge allows the state to think of its own role, and how it thinks of itself, but also how it thinks of its relationship to the people that it governs as well. So one of the things which Leo was talking about, which is really fascinating, is this kind of sense that a state guarantees the security of populations, and potentially where that kind of emerged from historically is something which is really fascinating to me. And I guess on a broader register, I look to kind of situate both these lines of inquiry, both matters of technical application and matters of the forms of knowledge through which states rationalize these actions. I try to situate these into debates that examine how governments respond to, but also actively seek to cultivate the particular political and economic conditions that might be said to constitute our contemporary conjuncture. So both to situate government action within these conditions, but to understand the government actions have a kind of recursive effect on those conditions as well. And I guess in the past, so Leo, I noticed that Leo's supervised by Ben Anderson at Manchester. I was at Manchester, Durham. I was supervised by him back in 2010. So it's nice to see what his current PhD students are doing now as well. So in the past, my PhD research, my overarching kind of research interests led me to kind of probe the myriad ways in which UK emergency response organisations draw upon technologies associated with the advent of big data, what was then called big data, and artificial intelligence to govern emergencies. And my focus here was on how these kind of wider technological turns have reshaped the way that governments imagine emergencies as risks and the political ramifications that arise when there's a move towards intervening in the present, but on the basis of a future yet to unfold. So looking, for instance, at how data reconstitutes populations as quote unquote risk. How data can lead to the reallocation of vital but diminishing resources in a context of government austerity and the imposition of austerity measures in the UK. Or how data can influence people's effective relationship to the state through the particularly through the projection of various emergency imaginaries, future imaginaries. And I think that this is something that Leo was talking about as well, which I found, fascinating, how governments operate on the basis of these kind of future imaginaries, and in so doing kind of create relationships to populations or people secured, and how we might think about those kind of imaginaries. I think is something really fascinating, something I we can discuss more. But this is kind of stuff that I've been, was working on, and do retain some of these kind of interests in my current work. But more recently, my interests have kind of led me more to kind of explore forms of resilience that governments are developing to respond to emergencies that are kind of on the rise with the changing climate. My interest here came from some research initially that I did in COVID on kind of developing resilience, new forms of resilience that are emerging in relation to COVID. And I'm kind of following it through now. This emphasis on resilience, particularly in relation to emergencies related to climate change. So I see resilience overall as a kind of ever more prevalent organizing principle for intervention, indicative of how emergency governance takes place now, and the broader political conditions in which these interventions take place. So with its focus specifically on interweaving adaptive capacities into existing anticipatory forms of governance, resilience foregrounds the kind of ontological precedents inscribed into government intervention now. So I think that the take-up of resilience actually reveals a lot about how governments are thinking about future emergencies. And I guess this actually resonates nicely with what Leo was saying as well. Thinking about emergencies beyond risk calculus, particularly. So the prominence of resilience, I think, shows the increasing acknowledgement by governments that futures can't be solely known through risk, and what Louisa Moore would call probability logics. And instead, the governments increasingly kind of adapt and seek to work with the radical uncertainty that shrouds our collective future. At the same time, I think resilience reflects, what I'm really interested in. Another aspect of resilience I'm really interested in, apart from this kind of temporal aspect, is the kind of spatial aspect, particularly how resilience reflects a particular spatial arrangement where responsibility for governing emergencies gets redistributed across different actors, operating at a variety of different spatial scales. And I think that such a redistribution of responsibility might prompt a reappraisal of both the kind of form that state power takes, how power is, often through the invocation of security as well, how this form is kind of arrayed and arranged. So how power is kind of recalibrated almost under resilience. But also the kind of relationships that states possess to wider society through this kind of recalibration. So yeah, I've started to develop this interest in resilience in recent times, and obviously resilience isn't a new kind of idea, but and to try to kind of offer some lines of reappraisal about the politics of resilience, I suppose I've kind of been treating it much more via, or situating it within the kind of a contemporary conjuncture, I suppose. So I'm interested in in how these kind of changes to state power under the name of resilience might intersect, might be judged to intersect with a specific set of historical conditions that I think punctuate our present moment. Specifically, I'm talking here about what Jovan Scott Lewis has referred to as a quote-unquote reparative conjuncture. So for Lewis, this conjuncture is produced at the intersection of a range of events that have happened or are happening almost contemporaneously with each other, and have kind of constituted how we think of our shared present. I think from reiterations of police orchestrated anti-Black violence, particularly in the United States, but also climate change and the effects of climate change and its instantiation through various different emergencies, to emerging geopolitical tensions in Palestine and Ukraine, and also the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'm interested in how this array of different events have come together to produce the particular conjuncture that I think that we find ourselves in, and how resilience as a mode of governance operates within this particular conjuncture. And as I've tried to show in a recent paper in the Geographical Journal, this paper came out in June last year called Disaster Reparations. I'm interested in reparations as a kind of ethos that shapes the way that we think of and relate to emergency. So reparations, particularly, I think allows us to understand the effects of emergencies by the broader historical processes that are developed over time in which they're kind of situated within. So reparations allows us to think emergencies historically, to paraphrase Lauren Ballard. Now, for some, resilience and reparations coming together would represent a kind of an anathema, I think. This is particularly the case for those that claim resilience as a kind of euphemism for state abandonment in an era of neoliberal reform. People that are interested in the connection that resilience has to just the withdrawal and minimization of state apparatuses. And I think that obviously we can see that in a lot of places, but for me, I think resilience is somewhat more complicated than this. So the story of resilience is instead one, much of the time, actually of heavy state intervention. And I think that actually Leo's talk probably testifies to this, in some ways. But with the state under the nomenclature of resilience taking new forms and instigating new kinds of relationships with wider society. And bringing reparations into this debate about resilience as heavy state intervention, I'm interested in the kinds of justice that underpin and are enacted through activities that the state undertakes in the name of developing resilience to emergencies. And my reading of kind of resilience, and this is just to get into some of the work I'm currently doing. I know I've got like 6 minutes left, so I'll try and be quick with this. So my reading of resilience at the moment, alongside reparations and justice, is something that I'm developing through ongoing research that I'm doing into the governance of heat waves, mostly in the United States. And on this, I'm writing 2 papers for 2 different special issues, and that's horrendously stressful. And and it would be great to get your feedback on some of the ideas that I've kind of tried to put into these papers. So one of these papers I'm writing for critical studies on security, and in this paper, what I'm exploring is what's called the Let's Talk About Heat Challenge, coordinated by the Environmental Protection Agency in the US, and which is designed to raise awareness of the dangers associated with extreme heat. Now, resonating with resilience as a kind of distributed form of governance, one that doesn't rely on centralized state authorities anymore. These awareness-raising practices are carried out by local community organizations that bid for government grants. And I'll show in the paper that these programs, these awareness-raising practices, seek to remediate people's relationship with their wider environment in order to cultivate affect-based capacities to sense the perils of extreme heat when these kind of perils arise in times of heat waves. But at the same time, these practices are designed also to make people more aware of the broader historical conditions that rendered them disproportionately vulnerable to extreme heat in the first place. So one of the ways that these awareness-raising exercises take place is like lots of these community organizations have developed YouTube videos kind of documenting past survivors of extreme heat stress. And rather than just going into how these people kind of felt as they were just before, they were kind of the victims of extreme heat, the videos actually go into the kind of the wider context. So one of the videos was based on kind of migrant agricultural workers in California who are the kind of, at least officially, like the most vulnerable people to kind of extreme heat. And the videos go into the need for better kind of worker protections of people working in kind of extreme heat. And then another a look at urban heat islands and look at not just how people experience heat stress in urban heat islands, but the fact that urban heat islands themselves are the result of urban planning decisions made that can be traced back to the 1930s and historic racist redlining of American cities at that point. And then the other paper, this is part of the special issue on resilience for Geoforum. And then this paper takes a different approach, a bit more of a broader approach, and looks at the Justice 40 initiative in the US and its impact on government resilient processes. So Justice 40 is this initiative that states that 40% of all the benefits that will arise from massive state intervention that took place in 2022, particularly through the Inflation Reduction Act, looking to mitigate a lot of the effects of climate change, that 40% of the benefits of that legislation would actually flow to quote unquote disadvantaged communities. Right, and kind of in contrast to the Let's Talk About Heat program, my focus here is on the kind of specific conceptualizations of justice that the US government is mobilizing in the resilience programs that have been enacted through these broad forms of legislation. So the paper here makes kind of two arguments. Firstly, through resilience, look at how the state increasingly looks to facilitate actions of others rather than intervene upon emergencies directly itself. And in so doing, the government responds to the need for both distributional and representative forms of justice, or at least it sees itself as doing that, which have been forms of justice that have been demanded by civil society organizations for decades in the United States. But at the same time, in taking this kind of facilitator role, rather than directly intervening themselves, the government doesn't acknowledge its own complicity in the production of historic injustices that have distributed the effects of emergencies in an uneven way now. So we might think about urban heat islands as an example of this historical injustice not being acknowledged, but at the same time, government actually mobilizing a particular form of justice. So whilst enshrining its actions in articulations of justice, important accountability issues remain. And then secondly, as kind of in this kind of facilitator role that I increasingly see government taking through resilience, the government can end up subsidizing programs carried out in the name of resilience, but that produce contradictory environmental effects. So some of the research that I did here has been on looking at how, in the name of new forms of intervention on climate change, the government is increasingly subsidizing carbon capture and sequestration projects in the United States. But then when we look at the local communities' kinds of reactions and responses to these projects, we see that they're beginning to complain about potential risks that these projects are kind of introducing into their neighborhoods. So there's this kind of contradictory kind of effect that arise when governments don't intervene but facilitate intervention on things like climate change. Yeah, so these papers are likely to be out in late 24, early 25. And I guess just to finish, some of the future research I'll be doing on what I'm kind of calling reparative resilience and its relationship to heat waves. So one thing, I want to do some kind of ethnographic research in the summer on how urban heat islands are kind of experienced and incorporated into the kind of broader sense of relation or non-relation that people bear with the places they inhabit. So I'm going to do some ethnographic work on urban heat islands in this way, and the kind of sense of belonging that get entangled with the way that people experience heat in urban spaces. And then secondly, I want to kind of clarify and elaborate upon reparative justice as it arises through resilience programs. And I'll leave it there. So thanks a lot for listening.
Thank you so much, Nat. So interesting. I'm really looking forward to reading those papers when they come out. A long time to wait, but really exciting. Before we open the floor to Q&A and just giving you all a second to collect your thoughts and questions, just want to flag that our next seminar will be in 2 weeks' time on measurement and metrics in disaster. We will stop the recording here and open the floor